Story 1. The logging road that loops back to yesterday. Derek Armstrong had been driving logging trucks in northern Ontario for 19 years, hauling timber from remote cutting sites to mills in Thunder Bay and Sudbury. His Peterbilt 389 was built for the brutal conditions of logging roads. Reinforced suspension, heavy-duty tires, a powerful engine that could pull massive loads up steep grades through mud, snow, and conditions that would destroy ordinary vehicles. Derek knew every logging road in the region, had driven them in every season and weather condition imaginable. On September 17, 2021, Derek was hauling a full load of spruce logs from a cutting site about 140 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay. The route took him along a series of logging roads that wound through dense boreal forest, crossing streams and climbing over rocky ridges where the Canadian Shield broke through the thin soil. It was a route Derek had driven hundreds of times, familiar enough that he could navigate it almost automatically. The day had started normally. Derek loaded his logs at 6 a.m., secured them properly with chains and binders, and headed south toward the mill. The weather was overcast but dry, temperatures around 12 degrees Celsius, typical for mid-September in northern Ontario. Derek planned to reach the mill by 2 p.m., unload, and possibly make a second run before dark if the dispatcher had another load ready. Around 10 a.m., Derek was about 60 kilometers into his drive when he noticed something odd. He passed a distinctive rock formation, a massive granite outcrop shaped like a breaking wave visible from the road. Derek knew this landmark well. It marked the approximate halfway point of his route, but something felt wrong about seeing it. The sunlight was hitting it from the wrong angle, as if the sun had shifted position in the sky. Derek checked his watch, 10:07 a.m. He checked his truck's clock, 10:07 a.m. But the light suggested it was earlier, maybe 8 a.m. based on the sun's position. Derek shrugged it off as tiredness playing tricks on his perception. He'd been up since 4:30 a.m., and fatigue could do strange things to how you processed sensory information. 10 minutes later, Derek passed another landmark, a burned-out logging truck that had been abandoned beside the road for years, its rusted frame a familiar sight. But Derek felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He'd passed this wreck already today, hadn't he? He checked his odometer and GPS. According to his instruments, he'd driven 72 kilometers from the loading site. That was correct for where the burned truck should be. But Derek could have sworn he'd seen it earlier. Derek grabbed his CB radio and called out, "Any drivers on the Thunder Bay logging roads you got your ears on?" A voice crackled back immediately. A driver named Pete, who Derek knew from the local trucking community. "Yeah, Derek, I hear you. What's up?" "Pete, where are you right now?" "Heading north on Road 801, about 20 clicks past the junction. Why?" Derek felt his stomach tighten. Road 801 was the road Derek was currently on, heading south. If Pete was heading north, they should be approaching each other. Derek should be able to see Pete's truck in the distance. "Pete, I'm southbound on 801. I should be seeing you any minute." "Negative, Derek. I've got clear visibility for at least 5 kilometers ahead. No trucks in sight." "You sure you're on 801? Derek looked at his GPS, at the road signs, at the landmarks around him. He was definitely on Road 801, but Pete couldn't see him and Derek couldn't see Pete. Derek felt the first whisper of real fear. "Pete, what time do you have?" 10:23 a.m. Why, your clock broken." Derek's clock also showed 10:23 a.m. They were in the same place at the same time, but couldn't see each other. Derek's hands were shaking on the wheel now. He tried to rationalize. Maybe they were on parallel sections of the road that curved around terrain features. Maybe the forest was blocking their line of sight. But he knew Road 801's layout. There were no sections where northbound and southbound traffic would be hidden from each other with 5 kilometers of visibility. Derek continued driving, his unease growing with every kilometer. He passed the wave-shaped rock formation again. Derek slammed on his brakes, his load surging forward against the chains. He'd passed that rock 30 minutes ago. It was impossible to encounter it again unless he'd somehow turned around without noticing, which was absurd. Turning around a fully loaded logging truck required careful maneuvering and plenty of space. Derek climbed down from his cab and examined the road. His tire tracks were clearly visible in the soft shoulder, fresh tracks heading south exactly as they should be. No evidence he'd turned around. He walked back along the road 100 meters looking for the tracks where he must have passed this spot earlier, but there were no other tracks, only one set, the tracks he'd just made. Derek pulled out his phone and called his dispatcher. "Linda, I need you to check my GPS tracker. Tell me where it shows I am." His dispatcher pulled up the tracking software that all the company trucks used. "You're on Road 801, 68 kilometers from the mill, right where you should be. Why?" "Because I've passed the same landmarks twice. The wave rock, the burned truck. I'm seeing them again. But my odometer says I've been driving continuously. I haven't turned around." Linda's voice became concerned. "Derek, are you feeling okay? Do you need to pull over and rest? Fatigue can cause confusion." "I'm not fatigued. Something's wrong with this road. It's looping somehow." Even as Derek said it, he knew how insane it sounded. Roads don't loop. Physics doesn't allow for driving continuously forward and ending up at a point you've already passed. Derek got back in his truck and continued, but now he was watching carefully, noting every landmark, checking his odometer obsessively. He passed a small creek with a wooden bridge. He remembered crossing this bridge at around 9:30 a.m. He passed a turnoff to a secondary logging road. He'd noted that turnoff earlier as well. Every landmark was repeating, appearing in the same sequence he'd encountered them before. Derek checked his fuel gauge. He'd used almost a quarter tank since leaving the loading site, which was correct for the distance he'd driven. But if he was somehow repeating sections of road, his fuel consumption should be higher. The physics didn't make sense. He was burning fuel consistent with driving 70-plus kilometers, but the road was showing him landmarks from earlier in his journey. Then Derek noticed his logbook lying open on the passenger seat. He'd made an entry when he started his trip, recording his start time and odometer reading. But there was another entry below it in his own handwriting that he didn't remember making. It read, 10:45 a.m. Something wrong with Road 801, landmarks repeating. Don't know how to get off this loop. Derek stared at the entry. The handwriting was definitely his. Same pen, same style, but he had no memory of writing it. And the timestamp was in the future. It was currently 10:38 a.m. He hadn't reached 10:45 yet. But there was the entry in his handwriting describing exactly what he was experiencing. Derek's hands were slick with sweat now. He grabbed his phone and took a photo of the logbook entry, then took photos of the road ahead, the landmarks around him, his dashboard instruments. He was documenting everything, creating evidence that this was happening, proof that he wasn't losing his mind. At 10:45 a.m., the exact time noted in the logbook entry he didn't remember writing, Derek's phone rang. He answered it and heard his own voice. "Derek, if you're hearing this, it means we're stuck in the loop. I don't know what's causing it, but every time I reach a certain point on this road, everything resets and I'm back at the wave rock. I'm leaving this voicemail for myself, for you, to warn you. I've been through this loop at least 3 times now. Each time I forget the previous loops until I find evidence I left for myself." The voicemail continued. "The loop starts at the wave rock and ends at the big cedar tree, the one that's split by lightning. When you reach that tree, you'll reset back to the wave rock. I don't know how to break out of it. I've tried turning around, tried taking side roads, tried stopping. Nothing works. We always end up back at the wave rock. And each loop, I'm using fuel. The engine is accumulating hours, but time resets. I think we're going to run out of fuel eventually and then we'll be stuck here permanently. The voicemail ended. Derek sat in stunned silence. He'd called himself from the future, or from a previous loop he didn't remember, to warn himself. He checked his phone's call history. The call had come from his own number. That was impossible. You can't receive a call from your own phone unless there were multiple versions of him existing in different iterations of the same time loop. Derek forced himself to think logically. If he was in a time loop that reset at a certain point, he needed to find a way to break out before running out of fuel. According to his gauge, he had about 3/4 of a tank remaining, enough for maybe 300 kilometers under loaded conditions. If each loop was approximately 20 kilometers, he could cycle through the loop maybe 15 more times before being stranded. Derek accelerated, watching for the big cedar tree his future self had mentioned. He found it 5 kilometers ahead. A massive cedar split down the middle by an old lightning strike, the two halves splayed open like a book. As Derek approached it, the air around him seemed to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Derek's vision blurred, his head spun with sudden vertigo, and then he was passing the wave-shaped rock formation again. The odometer had reset to showing 68 kilometers. His fuel gauge showed just under 3/4 of a tank, exactly what it had shown before. His clock showed 10:07 a.m. He jumped backward in time by 38 minutes back to the same point where he'd first noticed something was wrong. Derek immediately grabbed his logbook and wrote, 10:10 a.m. Second loop confirmed. Time resets at Lightning Cedar Tree, trying to document everything. He wrote quickly, knowing that if his memory reset with each loop, these notes might be his only way to build knowledge across iterations. Derek drove the loop again, this time trying to pay attention to everything, every detail of the road, the forest, the sky. He noticed something he'd missed before. The shadows weren't moving. The sun's position relative to the trees remained constant throughout the entire loop. Time was frozen at approximately 8 a.m. based on shadow angles, even though his clock showed progression from 10:07 to 10:45. This gave Derek an idea. If time was frozen at a specific point, maybe space was too. Maybe this section of road had become detached from normal space-time, existing in a bubble where the same 38 minutes played over and over. If that was true, the only way out might be to somehow puncture the bubble, to break the conditions that maintained the loop. Derek thought about what made this section of road different. It was deep in the wilderness, far from any human settlement, surrounded by ancient forest that had never been fully logged. The Canadian Shield bedrock created unusual magnetic anomalies throughout the region, and there were indigenous stories about certain places where time behaved strangely, where hunters would enter the forest and emerge hours or days later, thinking only minutes had passed. Derek remembered something an Ojibwe elder had told him years ago. The land has memory. Some places remember so strongly that they trap time, force it to repeat. If you find yourself in such a place, you must give something to break free. An offering, a sacrifice, something that matters. Derek looked at his load of logs. Timber was valuable. His livelihood depended on delivering loads successfully. But if he was trapped here forever, the logs meant nothing. Derek made a decision. At the wave rock where the loop began, he stopped his truck, climbed on top of his load, and began unfastening the chains and binders. It was dangerous work. A shifting log could easily crush him. But Derek worked carefully, releasing the load restraints. Then he climbed back in his cab, positioned his truck, and dumped the entire load. 40 tons of spruce logs rolled off his trailer, crashing into the forest beside the road, an offering to whatever force had trapped him here. Derek continued driving with an empty trailer. He felt lighter. Literally, his truck accelerated more easily, but also metaphorically, as if he'd shed a burden beyond the physical weight of the logs. As he approached the lightning cedar tree, Derek closed his eyes and whispered, "I've given my cargo. Let me pass. I respect this place. I acknowledge its power. Please let me pass." The shimmer came again, the vertigo, the sense of reality bending. But this time, when Derek opened his eyes, he wasn't back at the wave rock. He was past the cedar tree, continuing south on Road 801. His clock showed 10:47 a.m., 2 minutes after the time he should have reset. He'd broken the loop. Derek drove the remaining 60 kilometers to the mill without incident. When he arrived, his dispatcher was shocked. Derek's GPS had shown him stuck at the same location for hours, not moving, even though Derek had been driving continuously. The company's tracking system showed a gap in his journey, a void where data simply hadn't recorded. Derek filed his incident report and told his supervisor about dumping the load. The company sent a crew to recover the logs. They found them scattered beside Road 801, but not at the wave rock where Derek had dumped them. They were at the lightning cedar tree 30 kilometers further south, as if they'd teleported. Derek's tire tracks and chain marks were found at both locations, as if he'd dumped the load twice in 2 different places simultaneously. The company ordered Derek to take a week off for rest. He used that time to research the area where he'd been trapped. He found multiple reports going back decades, loggers, hunters, and prospectors who'd gotten lost on certain roads, walking or driving for hours only to find themselves back where they started. Some had died when their fuel or supplies ran out before they found escape. Others had simply vanished, never seen again, possibly still trapped in loops that never released them. Derek returned to work but refused assignments that took him past the lightning cedar tree. He told other drivers about his experience, warning them to be careful, to leave offerings if they felt the road behaving strangely. Some dismissed him as crazy, but others, older drivers, indigenous loggers who knew the traditional stories, they listened. They understood that the northern Ontario wilderness held places where normal rules didn't apply, where time could trap you as surely as a broken axle or a washed-out bridge. Derek Armstrong still drives logging trucks, but he approaches every remote road with greater respect now, with the awareness that some places exist outside normal space-time, that the ancient bedrock and ancient forests remember things humans have forgotten. That time itself can become tangled in certain locations where the barrier between normal and impossible grows thin. He keeps offerings in his truck, tobacco, coins, small valuable things he can give if he needs to buy his freedom from a place that won't let him leave. And he tells his story to anyone who'll listen, because somewhere in the vast logging road network of northern Canada, there are other loops, other traps, other places where yesterday and today become indistinguishable, and drivers can spend eternity driving the same 20 kilometers, burning fuel that somehow replenishes with each reset, living the same 38 minutes over and over until they figure out how to break free, or until they simply fade away into the eternal repetition. Story 2. The Grain Elevator Voices. Michael Patterson had been working as a grain elevator operator in rural Saskatchewan for 14 years, managing one of the massive concrete structures that dotted the prairie landscape like sentinels, storing wheat and canola from surrounding farms before shipment to processors and export terminals. His elevator was located outside the small town of Zealandia, about 80 kilometers northwest of Saskatoon, a classic prairie sentinel standing 30 meters tall, visible for kilometers across the flat agricultural landscape. On October 4th, 2022, Michael was working the night shift, receiving a late harvest delivery from a farmer who'd been combining wheat until well after dark. It wasn't unusual. Autumn in Saskatchewan often meant working around the clock to get crops off the fields before winter weather arrived. Michael was alone at the elevator, operating the receiving equipment that augured grain from the farmer's truck into the storage bins. Around 11 p.m., after the farmer had left, Michael was doing his routine checks on the bins, monitoring moisture levels, checking temperatures, ensuring the grain was settling properly in storage. The elevator was quiet except for the usual sounds, the creaking of the aging concrete structure, the whisper of grain shifting in the bins, the wind outside rattling the metal panels. Then Michael heard voices, clear as day, coming from above him in the elevator tower. Multiple voices, men talking, their words indistinct but the tone conversational, relaxed. Michael froze. There shouldn't be anyone else in the elevator. He'd locked the main entrance after the farmer left. The elevator was tall but narrow. There was nowhere for unauthorized people to hide, and Michael would have seen anyone climbing the internal ladder system. Michael called out, "Hello, is someone up there? The elevator is closed for the night." The voices stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-conversation. Silence followed, thick and somehow wrong. Michael grabbed his flashlight and began climbing the internal ladder toward the top of the elevator, toward the bin floor where the voices had originated. The climb was long. The ladder ran up the inside of the elevator shaft, passing multiple levels of machinery and grain storage. Michael's flashlight beam swept across concrete walls, steel support beams, the mechanical equipment that moved grain through the facility. Everything appeared normal, but as Michael climbed higher, he felt the temperature drop. By the time he reached the bin floor 30 meters up, his breath was condensing in visible clouds despite the fact that it was a mild autumn night outside. The bin floor was empty. No one was there. Michael checked every corner, every space behind equipment where someone might hide. Nothing. But the cold was intense now, and Michael could hear something new. Not voices, but breathing. Multiple sets of lungs drawing breath and exhaling, surrounding him in the darkness. Michael's flashlight began to flicker. He shook it, checked the batteries. They were fresh, should have hours of life remaining. But the light dimmed and brightened erratically as if something was interfering with the electrical current. And in the moments when the light dimmed to almost nothing, Michael saw them. Figures, translucent and gray, standing around the bin floor. 6 men wearing work clothes from decades past. Canvas overalls, heavy boots, cloth caps. They weren't looking at Michael. They were frozen in various positions, some reaching for equipment, others mid-step. All of them covered in a fine white dust that Michael recognized as grain dust, and their faces were contorted in expressions of absolute terror. Michael stumbled backward, nearly falling off the bin floor platform. His flashlight brightened again and the figures vanished. But Michael could still feel them, a presence that pressed against him, that filled the space with a suffocating sense of tragedy and horror. Michael half climbed, half fell down the ladder, desperate to reach ground level and get out of the elevator. He burst out into the cool night air, gasping, his heart pounding. He pulled out his phone and called his supervisor. "Dave, I need you to come to the Zealandia elevator right now. I just saw something impossible. There are people, ghosts, in the elevator. 6 men covered in dust, looking terrified. I need someone else here. I can't be alone with this." His supervisor's voice was tired but concerned. "Michael, calm down. Are you sure you saw people? The elevator's been empty since 1983 except for staff. There's nowhere for anyone to hide." 1983? What happened in 1983? There was a long pause. "You don't know? Michael, I thought you knew the history. The Zealandia elevator had an accident in 1983. Grain dust explosion. 6 workers were killed. The elevator was closed for 3 years for investigation and repairs. I thought everyone who worked there knew the story." Michael felt his blood turn to ice. 6 workers, 6 figures, all covered in dust, all frozen in terror. "Dave, I just saw them. I saw the men who died. They're still in there." Dave arrived 45 minutes later, bringing another employee with him. The 3 men entered the elevator together, flashlights and portable lights illuminating everything. They climbed to the bin floor. It was empty, the temperature normal, no sign of the figures Michael had seen. But Dave walked around the space slowly, his expression thoughtful. "My father worked here before the explosion," Dave said quietly. "He was supposed to be on shift that day, October 4th, 1983, but he called in sick. 6 other men covered for him. They were doing routine maintenance on the bin floor when something, probably static electricity, ignited the grain dust in the air. Grain dust is incredibly explosive when it's suspended in air at the right concentration. The explosion was instantaneous. All 6 men died before they could even move." Michael stared at him. "October 4th, 1983. Dave, what's today's date?" "October 4th, 2022, 39 years exactly." Dave met Michael's eyes. "Anniversary of the accident. My father says he sees them every year on this date. He won't come near the elevator in early October. Says the building remembers that the men are still trying to figure out what happened, still frozen in that last moment before the explosion." The 3 men stood in silence on the bin floor, the space where 6 men had died nearly 4 decades earlier. Michael could feel it now, a residual energy, a trauma imprinted on the location so deeply that it replayed annually for those sensitive enough to perceive it. The elevator hadn't just been damaged by the explosion, it had been marked, transformed into a memorial that wouldn't let the tragedy be forgotten. Over the following weeks, Michael researched the 1983 explosion. He found newspaper articles, accident reports, interviews with survivors and families. The 6 men who died had been experienced grain elevator workers, all in their 30s and 40s, all with families. They'd been doing a routine cleaning operation that should have been completely safe. But grain elevators are inherently dangerous. The dust is explosive, the confined spaces amplify any blast, and accidents happen with terrifying speed. Michael spoke with Dave's father, an elderly man named Robert who still lived in Zealandia. Robert confirmed he saw the figures every year on October 4th. "They don't know they're dead," Robert said. "They're frozen in that last second before the explosion, experiencing the terror of knowing something catastrophic is about to happen but not having time to react. The building holds on to that moment, replays it every anniversary. I see them and I feel guilty. I should have been there. Those 6 men died in my place." "It wasn't your fault," Michael said. "You were sick. You couldn't have prevented it." "I know that in my head," Robert replied, "but my heart doesn't accept it. And I think the building holds my guilt too, holds all the complicated emotions around that day. The grief, the survivor's guilt, the family's anger, the company's negligence. Grain elevators are dangerous, and that danger leaves marks." Michael continued working at the Zealandia elevator, but he approached October 4th each year with a mixture of dread and respect. The figures appeared every anniversary. Sometimes visible, sometimes only audible, sometimes just a presence that filled the bin floor with overwhelming sadness. Michael began leaving small memorials on those days, photos of the 6 men, flowers, written acknowledgments of their deaths and the tragedy of the accident. Other workers reported similar experiences at different elevators. The prairie landscape was dotted with grain elevators, and many had witnessed fatal accidents over the decades. Explosions, falls, workers buried alive in grain bins, crushed by machinery. The agricultural industry had a dark history of workplace deaths, and the buildings where those deaths occurred seemed to remember. Michael spoke with grain elevator workers across Saskatchewan and Alberta. He collected stories of ghostly figures, of voices calling out warnings, of equipment operating on its own, of cold spots and unexplained noises. A pattern emerged. The phenomena were strongest on anniversary dates, in locations where deaths had been sudden and violent, in old elevators that had witnessed multiple accidents over decades of operation. The grain elevators were monuments to the men who'd built and operated them, but also to the men who died within them. The massive concrete structures held memories in ways that defied explanation. Acoustic echoes of screams, thermal signatures of explosions, electromagnetic recordings of final moments. The buildings were haunted not by malevolent spirits, but by traumatic events so powerful they'd left permanent impressions on the physical structures. Michael eventually transferred to a newer facility, a modern elevator built with enhanced safety features and no history of fatal accidents, but he carries the memories of the Zealandia elevator, of the 6 men frozen in their final moment, of the building that refused to let their deaths be forgotten. And every October 4th, Michael observes a private moment of silence, thinking about the men who died doing dangerous work to feed a hungry world. Men whose last moments of terror echo annually through the concrete and steel monument where they spent their final seconds alive. The Prairie grain elevators stand as more than just agricultural infrastructure. They're repositories of history, holders of memory, monuments to the dangerous work that built the breadbasket of Canada. And some of them, the ones that witnessed the worst accidents, the ones where men died suddenly and violently, those elevators become something more, recording devices that play back tragedy, memorial sites that won't let the dead be forgotten, structures that bridge the gap between past and present by preserving the moments when ordinary work became fatal catastrophe. Michael Patterson knows the grain elevators remember. He's heard their voices, seen their figures, felt their presence. And he tells anyone who'll listen, respect the elevators, honor the men who died within them, and remember that every structure built by human hands holds the echoes of everyone who's worked, suffered, and died there. The Zealandia elevator remembers October 4th, 1983, and will continue remembering for as long as its concrete walls stand, preserving 6 voices and 6 figures for annual remembrance, ensuring that the men who died feeding the world will never be completely lost to history. Story 3. The Trans-Canada Shadow Driver. Rebecca Fontaine had been driving long-haul routes across Canada for 16 years, specializing in coast-to-coast runs between Vancouver and Halifax. Her Freightliner Cascadia was her mobile home, equipped with a comfortable sleeper cab, all the amenities for weeks on the road, and enough power to haul heavy loads across the Rocky Mountains and the vast prairies. Rebecca was a professional driver who knew every kilometer of the Trans-Canada Highway, every fuel stop, every weather pattern. On January 9, 2023, Rebecca was running eastbound through northern Ontario, having left Thunder Bay around 5 p.m. The winter weather was brutal, temperatures around minus 35 Celsius, winds creating whiteout conditions with blowing snow, visibility sometimes dropping to less than 50 meters. Rebecca was an experienced winter driver, but these conditions pushed the limits of safe operation. Around 10 p.m., somewhere between Marathon and Wawa on Highway 17, Rebecca noticed headlights in her mirrors. Another truck running behind her at a safe following distance, maintaining the same speed she was doing, about 50 kilometers per hour given the conditions. Rebecca was relieved to see another driver. In whiteout conditions, it was reassuring to know you weren't alone, that if something went wrong, there was someone nearby who could help. Rebecca grabbed her CB radio and called out, "Eastbound truck behind me on Highway 17, you got your ears on? These are some nasty conditions tonight." No response. Rebecca tried again. "Driver following me eastbound, just checking if you're okay back there. Visibility is terrible." Still no response, just static. Rebecca watched the headlights in her mirror. They maintained perfect distance, not too close, not falling behind, just steadily following. After 30 minutes of this, Rebecca tried the CB again. "Mystery driver behind me, at least flash your lights if you can hear me, but your radio isn't working." The headlights behind her remained steady, unchanged. Rebecca felt a prickle of unease. She was used to drivers who didn't use CB radios. Plenty of modern drivers relied on cell phones and didn't bother with CB communication. But something about the truck behind her felt wrong. The way it maintained such perfect distance, never varying, never adjusting, as if it were connected to Rebecca's truck by an invisible tether. Rebecca experimented by changing her speed. She slowed to 40 kilometers per hour. The truck behind her slowed exactly in sync. She accelerated to 60. The following truck accelerated to match. Rebecca tried sudden braking. The truck behind her braked with impossible precision, maintaining the exact same following distance with no overrun, no delayed reaction time. That wasn't normal. Human reaction time meant there should be slight variations in following distance, moments where the trailing driver closed the gap slightly during acceleration or fell back slightly during braking. But this truck moved in perfect synchronization, as if Rebecca's actions and the following truck's responses were happening simultaneously rather than sequentially. Rebecca pulled out her phone to call another driver she knew was somewhere on this route. Before she could dial, her phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown. Rebecca answered. "Hello?" A voice came through, distorted, wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Rebecca Fontaine. "You need to drive carefully tonight. Don't stop. Don't slow down more than you absolutely must, and whatever you do, don't try to let the truck behind you pass. Stay ahead of it." "Who is this? How do you know my name?" "I'm the driver behind you, and also ahead of you, and also beside you. I'm every driver who's died on this highway, Rebecca. We watch over the living when we can. There's black ice ahead at kilometer 342. It's going to try to send you into the ditch. When you reach it, keep your wheels steady. Don't brake. Don't accelerate. Just hold steady and you'll make it through." The call ended. Rebecca stared at her phone, her hands shaking. She checked her GPS. She was at kilometer 318. 24 kilometers to wherever this alleged black ice was waiting. Rebecca looked in her mirrors. The truck behind her remained constant, headlights cutting through the blowing snow, maintaining that impossible perfect distance. Rebecca didn't know what to believe. The call was insane. Ghosts of dead drivers banding together to protect the living? But the precision with which the truck behind her moved was equally insane, equally impossible. Rebecca decided to trust the warning. She had no good reason to, but instinct told her to listen. At kilometer 342, Rebecca saw nothing unusual in her headlights, just snow-covered highway, same as the previous 100 kilometers. But she remembered the warning. Hold steady. Don't brake. Don't accelerate. Rebecca maintained her speed, kept her hands light on the wheel, prepared for anything. Her truck hit the ice and immediately started sliding sideways. Rebecca fought every instinct to brake or correct. She held the wheel steady, maintained throttle, and felt her truck skating across the highway like a hockey puck. For 3 terrifying seconds, Rebecca was certain she was going into the ditch, that her truck would roll, that she'd end up buried in snow dying of hypothermia before help arrived. Then her tires found traction again. The truck straightened, the slide ended, and Rebecca was back in control, still on the highway, still moving forward. She'd survived something that should have sent her into the ditch, something she only survived because she'd been warned and had known exactly how to react. Rebecca looked in her mirrors. The truck behind her was gone. No headlights, no following vehicle, just darkness and blowing snow. Rebecca grabbed her CB radio. "Eastbound driver who was following me, where did you go? Are you okay?" Silence answered. Rebecca drove on, shaken. She called her dispatcher when she reached a rest area an hour later. "Linda, I need you to check the traffic around me. Was there another truck running close behind me between Marathon and Wawa tonight?" Her dispatcher pulled up the tracking data that showed all the company trucks in the region. "Rebecca, you're the only one on that section of highway. The nearest other driver is 80 kilometers behind you. There's been nobody near you for hours. That's impossible. I was being followed by another truck for at least 45 minutes. I saw headlights, a full-size tractor trailer maintaining perfect distance behind me. Honey, the tracking system doesn't lie. You've been alone on that highway. Linda paused. Rebecca, you've heard the stories about the shadow driver, haven't you? Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach. No? What stories? It's an old legend among drivers who run the northern Ontario routes. They say there's a ghost truck that appears during the worst winter conditions, that follows living drivers and protects them from accidents. Nobody knows who drives it or where it comes from. Some people say it's the collective spirit of all the drivers who've died on these highways, banding together to watch over the ones still alive. Other people say it's just a hallucination caused by fatigue and whiteout conditions. I wasn't hallucinating, Rebecca said quietly. Something followed me, and something called me to warn me about black ice, and that warning saved my life. Rebecca completed her run to Halifax, but the experience haunted her. She researched the shadow driver legend, collecting stories from other truckers. The reports were consistent. A truck that appeared during the worst conditions, that followed at a safe distance, that vanished when danger passed. Some drivers reported receiving phone calls with warnings. Others said the shadow driver flashed its lights to signal hazards ahead. A few claimed to have seen the shadow driver physically intervene, pulling vehicles out of ditches, blocking lanes to prevent accidents, even appearing in front of drunk drivers to force them to slow down and sober up. The phenomenon seemed to be concentrated on the northern Ontario section of the Trans-Canada Highway, particularly the stretch between Thunder Bay and Sault Ste. Marie, where winter conditions were especially brutal and accidents frequent. But there were reports from other dangerous sections too: the Rogers Pass in British Columbia, the Moncton area in New Brunswick, the route through northern Quebec. Rebecca spoke with a retired driver named Frank who'd been running Canadian highways for 40 years. Frank had seen the shadow driver multiple times. "It's real," Frank said with absolute conviction. "I don't care what skeptics say. That truck has saved my life at least 3 times. Once it blocked me from passing another truck right before that truck blew a tire and jackknifed. Another time it followed me through a whiteout and led me to a rest area right before I would have fallen asleep at the wheel. The last time it appeared ahead of me and its brake lights warned me about a moose on the highway that I couldn't see in the fog." "Who drives it?" Rebecca asked. "All of us," Frank replied. "Every driver who's died on these highways. We're a community, we look after each other. When we die, we don't stop being part of that community. We keep watching, keep helping when we can. The shadow driver isn't one ghost. It's all of us who've gone before, taking turns to manifest and protect the ones still driving." Rebecca didn't know if she believed that explanation, but she couldn't deny her experience. Something had followed her. Something had called her. Something had known about the black ice and had known exactly how to warn her. And that something had vanished the moment she was safe, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. Over the following years, Rebecca saw the shadow driver twice more. Once during a severe ice storm in Quebec, once during a blizzard in Saskatchewan. Each time, the mysterious truck appeared when conditions were most dangerous, followed at a safe distance, and vanished when Rebecca reached safer road sections. Each time, Rebecca felt protected, watched over, part of a community that extended beyond the boundary between life and death. Rebecca Fontaine continues driving the Trans-Canada Highway, hauling freight across the vast Canadian landscape. She no longer fears the worst winter conditions, knowing that she's not alone even when her GPS shows no other trucks nearby. The shadow driver is out there watching over everyone who drives these dangerous highways, manifesting when needed, protecting the living from the hazards that claimed so many drivers in the past. And Rebecca has made a promise to herself. When her time comes, when she eventually dies, whether on the highway or peacefully in old age, she'll join the shadow driver. She'll take her turn watching over the living, appearing during whiteouts and ice storms, following at safe distances, making warning phone calls, doing whatever is possible to protect the next generation of drivers from the dangers that lurk on Canada's winter highways. The community of drivers extends beyond death, and Rebecca is proud to know she'll eventually be part of that eternal watch, that collective spirit of protection that manifests as the shadow driver, guardian of the Trans-Canada Highway. Story 4. The fishing boat that caught yesterday's fish. Thomas LeBlanc had been fishing the waters off Nova Scotia for 28 years, running a small lobster boat out of Peggy's Cove. His boat, the Mary Catherine, was a classic Cape Islander, a sturdy wooden vessel built for the rough North Atlantic waters, equipped with hydraulic haulers for pulling lobster traps from the ocean floor. Thomas knew these waters intimately, had fished them in every season, understood the tides and currents and the locations where lobsters congregated. On November 21st, 2022, Thomas was checking his trap lines about 15 kilometers offshore in waters roughly 80 meters deep. It was a typical late autumn day, cold, overcast, seas running about 2 meters, conditions Thomas had worked in thousands of times. He was pulling traps systematically, checking them for lobsters, rebaiting with herring, and resetting them on the ocean floor. Around 10 a.m., Thomas hauled a trap that felt unusually heavy. Sometimes traps snagged on bottom debris or got fouled with kelp, adding weight. But when the trap broke the surface, Thomas saw it was full of lobsters. More lobsters than should be physically possible in a single trap. The trap was overflowing. Lobsters packed so tightly they were crawling over each other, easily 40 or 50 animals in a trap designed to hold perhaps a dozen comfortably. Thomas stared in amazement. In 28 years of fishing, he'd never seen a trap this full. He pulled it aboard and began sorting the catch, measuring lobsters, banding claws, tossing undersized animals back into the ocean. But as Thomas worked, he noticed something strange. Every single lobster in the trap was already banded. Someone had already caught these lobsters, measured them, and put elastic bands on their claws. Thomas examined the bands carefully. They were the same type he used. Standard commercial lobster bands, blue in color, identical to the ones in the bucket beside him. But Thomas knew with absolute certainty he hadn't caught these lobsters before. He checked his tags. Every lobster fisher in Nova Scotia used uniquely numbered tags on their traps. This trap had Thomas's tag on it, number TL347, one of his registered trap numbers. But the lobsters inside had already been caught and processed. Thomas checked the bands more closely and felt his skin prickle. The bands were weathered, degraded, clearly several days old at minimum. But Thomas had just set this trap line yesterday. The lobsters couldn't have been banded days ago and also caught in a trap that was set 24 hours earlier. Thomas's first thought was that someone had tampered with his traps. Another fisher stealing his catch and replacing it with already banded lobsters as some kind of prank. But that made no sense. Why would anyone go to the trouble? And how would they have Thomas's exact bands? Thomas inspected the bands under better light and saw something that made his blood run cold. Embossed on each band, barely visible, was a date code. Thomas's supplier dated all their bands for quality control purposes. The codes on these bands showed 23/22, November 23rd, 2022, 2 days in the future. Thomas stared at the codes, checked them again and again, pulled out his phone to verify today's date, November 21st, 2022. The lobsters in his trap had been banded 2 days from now. Thomas sat heavily on his boat's gunwale, trying to process what he was seeing. He'd caught lobsters that wouldn't be caught for another 48 hours. He'd hauled up his own future catch, pulled it from the ocean before the time when he would actually catch it. The implications made his head spin. Thomas continued checking his trap line, and every trap was the same, overflowing with already banded lobsters, all bearing date codes from November 23rd. Thomas caught and processed hundreds of pounds of lobster that morning, all of them pre-banded, all of them somehow displaced in time. When Thomas returned to the dock at Peggy's Cove, he weighed his catch and sold it to the usual buyer. The buyer didn't notice anything unusual. Lobsters were lobsters, the bands were standard, everything appeared normal. Thomas took his payment and went home, telling no one about the date codes or the impossibility of what he'd caught. The next day, November 22nd, Thomas went out fishing again. He hauled the same trap line, and this time, the traps were empty. Not a single lobster. Thomas checked every trap, all empty, all freshly baited, but not one animal inside. Thomas had never experienced a complete shutout before. There were always at least a few lobsters, even on bad days. On November 23rd, the date embossed on the bands from 2 days earlier, Thomas hauled his traps again. And they were full, overflowing with lobsters exactly as they'd been on November 21st. The same quantities, the same sizes, as if Thomas were experiencing the same catch twice. He processed the lobsters, banding them with bands from his November 23rd supply. And as he worked, he realized what was happening. He'd caught the same lobsters twice, once on November 21st, when he'd somehow accessed November 23rd's catch, and again on November 23rd when he caught them for real. The ocean had hiccuped, showing him a glimpse of his own near future, letting him harvest the same population of lobsters in 2 different time frames. Thomas tested this theory by marking several lobsters on November 23rd before releasing them. He clipped small notches in their tails, distinctive marks he would recognize. Then he waited until November 25th and hauled his traps again. Several of the lobsters he caught had the notches he'd cut 2 days earlier. These lobsters had been caught on the 23rd, marked and released, and caught again on the 25th. But here's what made Thomas's scalp prickle. In his holding tank at home, he still had lobsters from the November 21st catch. Lobsters that shouldn't exist, that represented a duplicate catch from a future that hadn't happened yet when he caught them. Thomas had effectively doubled his catch through some temporal anomaly that let him harvest the same population of lobsters twice. Thomas continued fishing, and the phenomenon repeated periodically. About once every 2 weeks, he'd haul traps full of already banded lobsters with future date codes. And then 2 days later, he'd catch the same lobsters again, normally. Thomas was catching each generation of lobsters twice, doubling his income through impossible time displacement. But Thomas felt deeply uneasy about it. He was violating something fundamental, not laws made by humans, but laws of physics and causality. He was taking more than his share, harvesting the ocean twice over through a loophole in time that shouldn't exist. And Thomas noticed the ocean changing around him. Other fishers began reporting poor catches. Lobster populations in the area seemed to be declining. Thomas realized he might be depleting the stocks by taking the same animals twice. Thomas made a difficult decision. He stopped keeping the time-displaced catches. When he hauled traps with future-dated bands, he removed the bands and released all the lobsters back into the ocean. He only kept the catches he made on the correct dates, the normal progression of time where each lobster was caught once and only once. The temporal anomalies continued. Thomas kept experiencing the glimpses of future catches, kept hauling traps full of already banded lobsters. But by releasing them immediately, Thomas believed he was preserving the causality, ensuring that when the real catch date arrived, those lobsters would be available to be caught properly. Thomas never learned what caused the time displacement. He researched the waters off Peggy's Cove and found no obvious explanation. No magnetic anomalies, no unusual geological features. Nothing that would explain why this specific location would allow glimpses of the future. Thomas concluded it was simply one of those places where the fabric of time was thin, where past and future could occasionally bleed into the present. Thomas LeBlanc retired in 2024, his long fishing career ending with mysteries he never solved but experiences he'll never forget. The ocean holds secrets deeper than any fishing line can reach, and time on the water flows differently than time on land. Thomas knows this now, knows that the catch you bring up today might also be the catch you'll bring up tomorrow. That the fish in your trap might have already been caught and released and caught again in an endless loop that violates every rule of linear time. And Thomas wonders, how many other fishers experience similar phenomena? How many catches are time-displaced, harvested twice, seen in glimpses of the future before they occur in the present? The ocean is vast and strange, and the men and women who work it know truths that landlocked scientists would dismiss as impossible. Thomas lived one of those truths, saw his future catch before it happened, held lobsters that existed in two times simultaneously. And though he can't explain it, he knows it was real, knows the ocean sometimes grants visions of what's to come, and knows that respecting those visions, releasing the time-displaced catch, maintaining the integrity of causality, is more important than the money he could have made by exploiting the temporal loophole. The waters off Nova Scotia continue their eternal rhythms, tides rising and falling, fish swimming and migrating, fishers setting and hauling their traps. And sometimes, in certain locations, under certain conditions, time itself ripples, allowing past and future to touch, giving fishers glimpses of catches yet to come, creating loops and paradoxes that should be impossible but aren't. Thomas LeBlanc knows this, lived this, and carries the knowledge that time on the ocean is more fluid than we imagine, more forgiving of impossibility, more willing to bend and fold and show us things we shouldn't yet be able to see. Story 5. The Northern Lights Voices. Sarah Mackenzie had been working as a bush pilot in the Yukon for 12 years, flying supplies, mail, and passengers to remote communities scattered across the territory's vast wilderness. Her de Havilland Beaver float plane was her office, and her companion, a reliable workhorse that could land on any lake or river and operate in the harsh conditions of Canada's far north. Sarah knew the Yukon's geography intimately, had flown over every mountain range and river valley, understood the weather patterns and the challenges of Arctic aviation. On September 3, 2021, Sarah was flying from Whitehorse to Old Crow, a small community on the Porcupine River near the Arctic Circle. It was a routine supply run, mail, medical supplies, and a passenger who worked for the territorial government. The weather was clear, the midnight sun providing continuous daylight even at 10 p.m., conditions perfect for the 4-hour flight north. Around 11:30 p.m., Sarah was cruising at 8,000 feet, passing over the Ogilvy Mountains, when she noticed the aurora borealis beginning to appear despite the fact that it wasn't yet dark. The northern lights sometimes appeared during summer twilight this far north, but seeing them during the extended daylight hours was unusual. Green curtains of light rippled across the northern sky, growing brighter and more active with each passing minute. Sarah's radio crackled with static, which wasn't unusual. The aurora often interfered with radio communications. But underneath the static, Sarah heard something else. Voices. Many voices, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, words that rose and fell in rhythm like singing or chanting. Sarah adjusted her radio, trying to clear the interference, but the voices grew stronger, more distinct. And now Sarah could pick out individual voices from the chorus, men, women, children, all speaking or singing in that unknown language. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm cabin of her aircraft. Her passenger, a Gwich'in woman named Martha Johnson, leaned forward from the back seat. "Do you hear that? The voices in the radio?" Sarah nodded. "I thought it was just interference from the aurora." "It's not interference," Martha said quietly. "Those are the ancestor voices. The aurora carries them. My grandmother told me stories about this, that when the northern lights are particularly strong, you can hear the voices of everyone who's died in the north, all of them singing together, all of them watching over the living." Sarah wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but the voices were undeniable. And as she listened more carefully, she thought she recognized fragments. Not specific words, but phonemes and sounds from multiple languages. Gwich'in, Inuktitut, English, French, all mixed together in a chorus that seemed to emanate from the aurora itself. Then one voice separated from the chorus, speaking clearly in English. "Sarah Mackenzie, change your course. Storm ahead at Old Crow. The runway is flooded. Divert to Eagle Plains." The voice was female, old, authoritative. Sarah grabbed her radio and called Old Crow. "Old Crow traffic. This is Beaver Charlie Foxtrot Alpha approaching from south. Request weather and runway conditions." Static answered. Sarah tried again. "Old Crow, do you copy?" Still nothing but static. Sarah checked her weather data. According to her instruments and the forecast she'd checked before departure, Old Crow was clear with good visibility. But the voice from the aurora had warned of storms and flooding. Sarah looked at Martha. "Did you hear that? The voice warning about Old Crow?" Martha nodded. "That was Elder Mary Jacobs' voice. She died 3 years ago. She was a knowledge keeper, knew everything about the land and the weather. If her voice is warning you, you should listen." Sarah made a decision based on nothing but an impossible voice transmitted through the aurora borealis. She altered her course, diverting to Eagle Plains, a small airstrip about 80 kilometers southwest of Old Crow. Her passenger was supposed to be an Old Crow, but Sarah's instinct told her to trust the warning. As Sarah approached Eagle Plains, she tried the Old Crow frequency again. This time, a voice answered. The local RCMP officer. "Any aircraft, this is Old Crow RCMP. Be advised the runway is closed due to flash flooding. We had a sudden severe storm about 20 minutes ago. The Porcupine River overflowed and the entire airstrip is underwater. Do not attempt to land at Old Crow." Sarah's hands were shaking on the control yoke. The warning from the aurora had been accurate. Old Crow's runway was flooded, exactly as the impossible voice had said. If Sarah had continued on her original course, she would have arrived at Old Crow to find nowhere to land, forcing her to divert in a rush with fuel running low. The early warning had given her time to divert safely. Sarah landed at Eagle Plains and arranged alternative transportation for her passenger. Then she sat in her plane watching the aurora dance across the sky, still hearing the faint chorus of voices in her radio's static. Sarah pulled out her phone and researched Elder Mary Jacob. She found obituaries and memorial pages. The woman had died in 2018, had been a respected knowledge keeper in the Gwich'in community, had been known for her ability to predict weather with uncanny accuracy. And somehow, her voice had reached across death to warn Sarah, transmitting through the aurora borealis, like the northern lights were a vast communications network connecting the living and the dead. Over the following years, Sarah heard the aurora voices multiple times, always during strong auroral displays, always when she was flying over remote wilderness. The voices warned her about weather, about mechanical issues before they became critical, about wildlife on remote runways. And Sarah learned to listen, to trust the warnings from the ancestor voices that spoke through the northern lights. Other pilots reported similar experiences. The aurora seemed to be a medium for communication from those who died in the north, their voices carried on the electromagnetic waves that created the light displays. Scientists couldn't explain it. The aurora was a natural phenomenon. Ionized particles colliding with atmospheric gases, nothing that could carry human voices. But the pilots knew what they heard, and the warnings they received were too accurate to be dismissed as hallucination or imagination. Sarah Mackenzie continues flying the Yukon skies, but she pays close attention to the aurora now, listening to her radio carefully during displays, treating the northern lights as both a natural wonder and a communications system that connects her to the generations of pilots, guides, and travelers who've died in these remote regions. The aurora remembers them all, carries their voices, allows them to watch over the living and offer warnings when danger approaches. And Sarah knows that when her time comes, when she eventually dies, whether in a crash or peacefully in old age, her voice will join the chorus in the aurora. She'll watch over future pilots, will warn them of storms and flooded runways, will be part of the eternal community of northern spirits who speak through the lights, protecting the living from dangers they can't yet see, ensuring that the knowledge of the ancestors continues guiding those who fly, drive, and travel through Canada's vast northern wilderness. Story 6. The Mine Shaft That Breathes. David Kowalski had been working as a mining engineer in northern Quebec for 17 years, primarily in underground gold mines around Val-d'Or and Rouyn-Noranda. His expertise was in ventilation systems, ensuring adequate airflow in deep underground workings, designing fans and ducting to bring fresh air to miners and remove toxic gases and heat. David understood underground environments better than most people understood their own homes, knew how air moved through tunnels, how pressure differentials affected breathing, how deadly the absence of proper ventilation could be. On March 15, 2023, David was called to consult on an abandoned mine near Malartic that was being considered for reopening. The mine had been closed since 1987, shut down when gold prices dropped and made the operation unprofitable. Now, with higher gold prices, the current owner wanted to assess whether reopening was viable. David's job was to inspect the ventilation infrastructure, determine what would need to be replaced or upgraded. David descended into the mine through the main shaft, riding a temporary elevator installed for the inspection. He was accompanied by 2 other engineers and a geologist, all of them wearing full safety equipment, including breathing apparatus in case they encountered bad air. The mine descended nearly 600 meters below surface, with multiple levels of tunnels branching off the main shaft. At the 500-meter level, David noticed something unusual. Air was moving through the abandoned tunnels, not strongly, but enough to be noticeable. David held up a hand to feel the airflow. It was coming from deeper in the mine, flowing toward the main shaft, a gentle breeze that shouldn't exist. The mine had been closed for 36 years. All the ventilation fans had long since stopped operating. There should be no air movement or at most minimal convection currents from temperature differences. But this was stronger than convection could explain. David pulled out his airflow meter and measured the velocity, 0.8 meters per second, a significant flow rate, and the air was moving rhythmically, surging slightly stronger for a few seconds, then weakening, then surging again. Like breathing, like the mine was inhaling and exhaling. David looked at his colleagues. "You feel that? The air is moving, and it's pulsing." The other engineers nodded, clearly as puzzled as David. The geologist, an older man named Pierre, had a strange expression on his face. "This mine has always breathed," Pierre said quietly. "The old miners talked about it. Said the mine was alive, that it breathed with them. Some of them said the mine breathed in miners who died down here, took their spirits into its depths." David dismissed that as superstition. "It's probably connected to an aquifer or an underground void that's creating pressure differentials. Natural caverns can create breathing effects through seasonal water level changes." But even as he said it, David didn't fully believe his own explanation. The rhythm was too regular, too much like biological breathing rather than random pressure fluctuations. The inspection team continued deeper into the mine, following the 500-meter level tunnels toward the areas where gold had been extracted. The breathing effect grew stronger the further they went from the main shaft, and David began to notice something else. The air temperature was fluctuating with the breathing rhythm. During the exhale phase, the air grew warmer. During the inhale phase, it cooled slightly. That was impossible. Air temperature in deep mines was typically constant, controlled by the geothermal gradient and insulated by the surrounding rock mass. Fluctuating temperatures suggested an active heat source, something generating warmth and then dissipating it in regular cycles. The team reached a section of the mine called the Deep East Extension, the furthest extremity of mining at the 500-meter level. Here, the breathing effect was powerful, air surging past them with enough force to move their clothing, the temperature swings dramatic enough to feel clearly. David measured everything: airflow velocity, temperature, humidity, pressure. All the parameters were cycling in rhythm, a perfect sine wave with a period of about 8 seconds, 4 seconds of exhale, 4 seconds of inhale. Then David heard something that made his blood freeze. Underneath the sound of moving air, there were voices. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Many voices speaking in French and English, words indistinct but the cadence human. David grabbed his colleague's arms. "Stop. Listen. Do you hear that?" They all fell silent, and they all heard it. Voices carried on the breathing air, whispers that surged with each exhale and faded with each inhale. Pierre crossed himself. "The mine is speaking. It's telling us the names of the dead, the men who died down here over a century of mining." David wanted to find a rational explanation, but he had none. He was hearing human voices in air moving through an abandoned mine where no one should be present. The voices weren't on the radio or the communication system, they were in the air itself, acoustic vibrations carried by the breathing currents. David recorded audio, documented everything with his instruments. Then the team quickly retreated, none of them willing to spend more time in the Deep East Extension than absolutely necessary. As they ascended toward the surface, the breathing effect weakened and the voices faded. By the time they reached the 200-meter level, the mine felt dead and still, just another abandoned industrial space. Back on surface, David reviewed his recordings. The voices were there, captured clearly on his digital recorder. Dozens of voices speaking French and English, saying things David couldn't quite make out, but that sounded like names, dates, locations. David sent the recordings to audio specialists who cleaned them up and enhanced them. What emerged was chilling. The voices were saying names and dates, miners' names and the dates they died. Pierre Gagnon, 1923. Thomas Murphy, 1934. Jean-Claude Bertrand, 1961. David researched the mine's accident records. Every name and date corresponded to a documented fatality. Miners who died in cave-ins, gas explosions, falls, and other accidents over the mine's 100-year operational history. The mine was remembering its dead, exhaling their names, keeping an acoustic record of everyone who'd perished in its depths. David had no explanation for how this was possible. Rock and air don't store human voices. Physics doesn't allow for audio recordings to persist for decades without a recording medium. But the evidence was undeniable. The mine was speaking, was breathing, was maintaining some kind of living memory of the men who died within it. David wrote his report recommending against reopening the mine. He cited ventilation concerns, unstable ground conditions, things that were true but not the real reason for his recommendation. The real reason that the mine was alive in some way, that it breathed and spoke and remembered. David kept to himself. No one would believe it, and including it in an official report would end his career. But David spoke privately with other mining engineers, asking carefully worded questions about their experiences. And he discovered that the breathing mine phenomenon was known to many experienced underground workers. Mines that had witnessed multiple fatalities often developed breathing patterns as if they'd become aware, as if the trauma of violent death had transformed them from mere excavations into something more. Living tombs that held on to the spirits of the men who died within them. David Kowalski continues working in mining, but he treats mines differently now, with respect bordering on reverence, with the awareness that these underground spaces are more than just holes in the ground. They're repositories of human effort and human tragedy, places where men have spent their lives and sometimes lost them. Environments that somehow absorb and remember the experiences of everyone who's worked and died within them. And in the quietest moments, in the deepest levels of active minds, David still listens carefully. Sometimes he hears the breathing, that gentle rhythmic airflow that shouldn't exist but does. And sometimes, very faintly, he hears the voices. Miners from the past speaking their names and dates, ensuring they're not forgotten. That their sacrifice building the infrastructure of modern civilization isn't lost to history. The mines remember, the deep places breathe, and the dead speak through moving air in abandoned tunnels, their voices carried on impossible currents, their names exhaled by stone and darkness that somehow became alive through the accumulated tragedy of industrial accidents and the dangerous work of extracting wealth from the earth's depths. David knows this now, has heard it and recorded it, and carries the knowledge that some places don't die when humans abandon them. They continue living, continue breathing, continue remembering everyone who entered and never left.